Welcome to another episode of the Battlefields Bourbon podcast. I'm Jack, joined as always by my co-host Elijah. We are coming to you from the historic Strayer House in beautiful Newmarket, Virginia. The Strayer House is preserved and maintained by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields National Historic District. The beautiful logo you see behind us. The National Historic District is the official sponsor of the Battlefields and Bourbon podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, consider becoming a member of the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, which is the managing body of the National Historic District. This episode specifically is sponsored by History Fix. If you want to bring fascinating historical events, civilizations, and figures right into your living room, check out History Fix. Join them for movies, documentaries, short films, and how-tos. Historic eras currently range from the 21st century all the way to the 1st century. The team of curators bring you the most comprehensive and authentic historical content available. Battlefields and Bourbon podcast fans, you listeners, are eligible to receive an extra 20% off your first year's annual subscription. Sign up for History Fix at www.historyfix.com and use promo code BATTLEFIELD. That's BATTLEFIELD. Every subscription includes a 7-day risk-free trial. After signing up, download the History Fix app. Most places you stream your shows from. Escape into history today with History Fix. And Elijah, our glasses are empty. Let's fill them up. We've got a special episode today. Why don't you introduce our bourbon for this episode?
Well, this one is one I've been wanting to do for ever since we started this podcast. This is going to be Stagg and George T. Stagg, the man. So without further ado, we can... Yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah.
Can give it a little tasting here. So those of you who are not familiar with Stagg Bourbon, this is Buffalo Trace's Mash Bill 1 barrel proof expression. It is 132 proof here. This is batch 22A. Mash Bill 1 is their low rye mash bill. So it's the same thing as their flagship product, Buffalo Trace, as well as E.H. Taylor. Unfortunately, with Sazerac whiskeys, we don't know the exact mash bill. We've discussed that in previous episodes as well. But Stagg was initially released in 2013 as Stagg Jr., supposedly easier to find bourbon than George T. Stagg, which was released in 2002. As we see today, that's not as easy to find as you may think. But on the nose, I mean, it's heavy with the cherries. Similar to what you would get from Buffalo Trace and E.H. Taylor. It's just more amplified, obviously, because it's significantly higher proof alcohol content, so you can get all of those notes off of that.
132 proof is pretty crazy coming out the gate.
And that one will take some getting used to.
Yeah.
It's got some heat to it, but it is good once you kind of acclimate your palate to that, get all the flavors out of that one. According to the label, it's aged for nearly a decade, so people like to say it's a 10-year bourbon. It is about $50 to $60 MSRP. I got that for right in between that. However, you'll see that many stores in private states are going to be significantly higher than that. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of the secondary market with bourbon these days.
How'd you get your hands on this bottle?
I got this one at a local store outside of Virginia, one that I've built a good relationship with. So they were kind enough to help me out with that. That's actually the second bottle I've gotten from that store, but they've helped me out. So yeah, it's been nice to be able to get some good stuff outside of the Commonwealth. But Stagg, as you'll see on this bottle, it does not have the junior on the label. They dropped that in after batch 17, I shouldn't say 2017, it was after batch 17. So anything after that, this one being 22A, it's just Stagg.
I mean, I've always heard people talk about it. Some people say it's like the best. You've compared it to like, a twin almost, but a better twin in a way of a Buffalo Trace.
That's the way I like to describe it, yeah.
It's a lot more rich and darker. You can definitely tell there's some age behind this thing.
Yeah.
And is this uncut or no?
Yeah, uncut, unfiltered.
Yeah,
so that means it's straight from the barrel.
Just taking the big pieces of wood out after you dump it, right?
Yeah, they just strain it. I think that's about it. Just to strain out all the barrel char, but that's all they do to it. It's not filtered by any means. It's very bold. It lives up to the name. But yeah, like I said, it's very similar as far as Buffalo Trace and E.H. Taylor. You can get that low rye mash bill. It's very corn heavy. It's very, very sweet in that regard. Almost some caramel popcorn in that one, if you pick that one up.
I get the caramel. It just feels like there's not maltiness, but that feels like the right word, but just like really rich flavors you're getting out of that. You can tell there's age with it. It's really good. Dark.
And this is one of few bourbons that you actually, when people say like leather and some of those darker notes, like that's one that you actually pick up on this one, which is kind of interesting. But
I'm not there yet.
You'll get there. Yeah, I mean, well, that is probably the highest proof you've had on the show so far.
Yeah, so maybe. Yeah, the color's great though. That's the one thing you'll notice. I mean, I don't know if it's like the back labels and stuff. I mean, it's definitely a trick with the bottle. I'm sure that back label being black. But it just makes it seem like such a dark.
It almost looks black in the bottle.
In the bottle.
It's that dark.
But it is, I mean, it's pretty dark when you've got it in a glass, too. It's nothing crazy. And the bottle, looking at the bottle itself, I like to rate bottles, The antlers, it's something you don't normally see, I guess. And, it just seems pretty, it's very simplistic, the bottle. The bottle shape's pretty standard compared to other bourbons. Very similar almost to... I think that one bottle of Clyde Mays we had was that similar shape. I know Devil's Due out of West Virginia, they have that same bottle shape. So the bottle shape isn't, it's not something where you're going to buy the bourbon just because of the way it looks bottle wise. So, but it's, it's recognizable though. I mean, you see a bottle of Stagg, it's Stagg. So yeah,
basic but unmistakable. But yeah, going off of that. This episode is going to be about the namesake of this bottle. It'll be George T. Stagg. Unfortunately, we couldn't get our hands on George T. Stagg from the Antique Collection for this episode, obviously because that's not easy to get. Neither was this one. But George T. Stagg, just kind of starting off with his early life, the man was born in 1835 in Jared County, Kentucky, just outside of Lancaster, if any of you are familiar with that area. He grew up in, like I said, Lancaster, and married Elizabeth Doolin, nicknamed Betty, in 1858.
We'll call her Betty.
Yeah, we'll call her Betty. And they settled in Richmond, Kentucky. So kind of near bourbon country. Not to say that that's where he got his start with whiskey, because as far as I know, that's not the case. He actually started out selling shoes. It was kind of like a traveling shoe salesman, selling in bulk. So that's where he got his start as a salesman. Later uses that for whiskey. But yeah, I mean, he did that for 3 years, and then the Civil War breaks out. And in November of 1861, he enlisted with the Union Army. I've read some accounts that people think that he enlisted due to his religious beliefs as far as slavery goes. I can't confirm or deny that, but that's just one of the things that I read as far as his convictions as far as enlisting. And as we know, Kentucky was very split as far as pro-union or pro-secession. One example of that being John C. Breckinridge from a previous episode with the Battle of Newmarket. He's a Kentuckian as well, from Lexington. Yeah, earned a reputation in his regiment. He enlisted with the 21st Kentucky at Camp Hobson. So he was with the 21st Kentucky Infantry, and by January of 1862, this guy is already a first lieutenant. Receives a field commission for a first lieutenant. So he's climbed the ranks in just a couple months. Yeah. And a fun fact about him: he actually has a reputation as a bare knuckle fighter.
Okay.
So, what better pastime in camp than to
something in that Kentucky water? Wasn't Lincoln?
Yeah.
He liked to partake in some boxing too, I think.
He was a wrestler.
Fighting. Yeah,
he was a well-known wrestler.
Yeah. So something in that Kentucky water.
Something to pass the time there. But yeah, by summer of 1863, Stagg is already a captain in the Union Army. So he's obviously well respected by his men, well admired, and obviously enough to climb the ranks that quickly. I mean, that's something you don't see very
impressive,
often.
Yeah.
But after his promotion to captain, he eventually gets chosen as an aide-de-camp to General Ambrose Burnside. So a fella who has been here in Virginia makes his way out west, and there we've got a
Well, it's good he makes that attachment, or gets that change in position in the summer of '63. So he's Burnside's done the damage he needs to with his career. So,
yeah, exactly.
Well, that's cool. I mean, he's moved up. So from the start of the war in November all the way up until the summer of 1863, he's, went from the bottom of the barrel up working, hand in hand with a general, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah,
wow.
About 2 years' time. But yeah, the 21st Kentucky, they see some considerable action out west. They participated in battles like Franklin, Nashville, Stones River. Some of you may know that as Murfreesboro. The Southerners may know it as the name of the town. Kennesaw Mountain, Atlanta, Jonesboro, as well as the Battle of Perryville, Kentucky. So one of those being at least a little bit close to home.
Yeah, heavily, engaged Western Theater regiment, and in the Western Theater, that's that lineup of battles is pretty impressive in the way you can use it. Wow.
Yeah, because those are, that's some of those are like they stand out as far as
they're
Western theater action.
They're major battles in the West, and yeah, that's pretty impressive that he was. I didn't know he fought in the Civil War until right before we decided to do this episode. So I found that fascinating because I really thought E.H. Taylor or somebody would have more of that connection because the colonel name and
which surprisingly I can't find any military service on him. So I don't know. I think that's just a Kentucky colonel type of label for him.
No, there's great. Already the lineup of battles that he's participated in, and that regiment, the 21st, has participated in is very impressive for a Western Theater regiment. So,
and surprisingly, for all of the action that they were involved in, only 67 enlisted men killed. I did see a conflicting report there that it was 57. Give or take 10. Yeah, come on. Yeah. 3 officers killed. Obviously, he was not one of them. And then 178 died due to disease. So, you're losing more than double that just off of disease, let alone combat. So it's kind of that number there really puts it into perspective how much life was claimed due to disease as opposed to battlefield casualties.
Wow.
But yeah, after the war, he mustered out in January of 65, so he missed the surrender. Their regiment, I believe, was a three-year enlistment, and he got out January of 65, just before the end of the war. And
he was done? Didn't re-enlist?
Done. Nope,
okay.
Did not re-enlist. Guess he had enough of that with dealing with Burnside.
I'm sure.
But afterwards they move out to St. Louis, Missouri.
Okay.
He picks up his family. They move to St. Louis, and he meets a man by the name of James Gregory. This guy sees some potential with Stagg as far as his sales capabilities. Obviously, his military career, that regimented lifestyle, it's gonna draw him to Gregory. He's like, this guy's really got his stuff figured out. Mm-hmm. And they end up forming Gregory and Stagg commercial agents or commercial merchants and distillers agents. So they are basically distributors for whiskey and distillers and stuff like that. So they are kind of like what I guess you would say RNDC is today, or other major distributors are today. Yeah. But yeah, he gained experience working with distilleries from that. That kind of is what sets us up for him making his way to what is now Buffalo Trace Distillery. So he worked with. Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there. He works with folks such as Old Forester, E.H. Taylor. Worked closely with him as far as distributing his products before kind of taking over his business venture. But yeah, he kind of knew the game going into it once by the time he comes to take over that distillery. 10 years worth of experience doing that. And then as far as, the financial state of the world come 1873, the world is struggling financially. And E.H. Taylor, not being immune to that, is one of those people. He owed Gregory and Stagg $150,000, which today's money, obviously it doesn't sound like a lot today, but today's money, that's the equivalent of about $4 million.
Oh, my goodness.
A little over $4 million. Wow. Yeah, he was in debt to his eyeballs, as some might say. That was in 1877 that was reported, that he owed them that much.
Okay.
Stagg, being the savvy businessman that he is, decides to work a deal with Taylor, and in exchange for settling his debt, Stagg would take over the Old Fire Copper Distillery, which is now Buffalo Trace, and the Carlisle Distillery, which I don't believe is operational any longer. But those were the two holdings that Taylor had leading up to this. Yeah. And Stagg was like, I'll take both of them off your hands, and in exchange, you owe me nothing. So
Wow.
that's what he did. Yeah, he took over as the president of the distillery. Taylor still had shares in the company. It was a minority share. We'll get to that here in a second, just the exact math on that, how that split. But he was the vice president, more or less a figurehead. The big thing with Stagg was that he wanted to keep Taylor affiliated with the company just because of his name recognition. Everybody knew who he was. Everybody knew him for good quality whiskey. So he wanted to keep him on as far as, keeping that attached to his brand, which makes sense. I mean, at that time, as we had discussed in other episodes, distilleries were all over the country prior to Prohibition. They're everywhere. You could pick one out and it could be horrible, or you could go with the one that everybody knows and is great. So that's why he did that with Taylor. He called the company E.H. Taylor Jr. Company. Although he's the president, he's still naming it after Taylor because he's that desperate to keep his name attached to the company. And there was 5,000 shares of this company between two distilleries. Stagg had 3,448 shares. Taylor had 1,552. So just a little bit, just enough to call himself a part owner.
Yeah.
But it only took them 6 years before they really started to go south with their relationship. I think Stagg was I think they're two very bold and conflicting personalities there. Is the way I understand it. I think Taylor had his ways, and so did Stagg, and they weren't the same ways. Yeah. Taylor was an old man by this time, so he, being the stubborn old man that he was, didn't want to do things the way that Stagg did. They didn't always see eye to eye. So he actually ends up trying to get out of his stake in the company.
This is Taylor.
Yeah, Taylor.
Okay.
Taylor wants out. He's like, I'm done with this. I can't work with this guy anymore.
Yeah.
There's even, when you tour the distillery, there's even a funny little anecdote that they will tell you that the main office building for the president and vice president, they actually built a brick wall down the middle of that office room. So say how we're sitting here. Yeah. They walled off the middle, like straight down the middle of that, just because they couldn't stand to work so close to each other. They separated.
And they say the wall's still there?
I don't know. I've never seen that part of the distillery. There's so much to see at Buffalo Trace. Sure, if you go tour the place, I mean, it's incredible how much there really is to see and do there. You could never do it all in one day. But so in order to get Taylor out of those remaining shares, Stagg offers him a third distillery from a separate venture that he's got going on. So Stagg has three distilleries. And this one, I forget what the name of it is, but he gives that one to Taylor in exchange for those remaining 1,500 shares of Old Fire Copper and Carlisle. And that distillery is what Taylor calls the Old Taylor Distillery, which today is now Castle and Key. Okay. So, there's the way that ties in there. That is now Castle and Key Distillery. And even after Taylor...
Still separate or still...
They're separate. Yeah, Taylor is running his own show now again. Okay. He's back to running his own thing with any
Castle
kind
and
of...
Key.
Well, this is called Old Taylor.
Okay, Old Taylor.
Yeah, Castle and Key is
but
more...
what we know today is...
Yeah, what we know today is that. So that's how that worked out. They kind of severed their relationship. Stagg, this is kind of sketchy, the way this works, but Stagg ended up keeping Taylor's name on some company product and letterhead and stuff like that, just to continue to hang on to that Taylor name, which is kind of funny that he would do that even after such a bad breakup, if you will. Taylor found out about that, and he was livid. He's like, there's no way you're going to continue to profit off of my name after I've left, and we've settled our differences, or so he thought. And they, in 1890, settled out of court for that. So Stagg had to rebrand to the George T. Stagg and Company. So that's where you get that from, where they go from, changing hands down the line. And this went on for 4 years. This happened in 1886 when Taylor left. By 1890, they settled out of court. So it took Taylor 4 years to really figure out, he's still using my name. And let's take this to court. So that was kind of interesting that it was that long of a legal dispute. But obviously, you lose your right-hand man, or as much of a right-hand man as you have, your workload's going to increase. And Stagg just got bogged down with workload of two distilleries because Taylor was technically the head honcho at the Carlisle distillery. So while Stagg oversaw the the operations there at Old Fire Copper, Taylor was running Carlisle. That way it was kind of like splitting the workload and, taking the burden off of one or the other.
Yeah.
Since he left, Stagg now had to work 2 distilleries. And that, I believe, probably rushed him to an early grave. I think that probably stretched him out a good deal.
So he dies young.
He does. He was only 58 when he died.
Wow.
From what I read, he died in Baltimore, Maryland. Whether or not that's true or not, I'd need somebody to confirm, but that's the accounts that I've read. But yeah, he died at the age of 58 in 1893. Poor health, and obviously the stress from that rushed him to an early grave. But he is now buried in Richmond Cemetery in Richmond, Kentucky, so he made his way back home to Richmond. They did a lot for him as far as, his gravestone. If you look at that online, it's a pretty cool looking headstone there for him. But 1904 rolls around. They rename Old Fire Copper Distillery George T. Stagg Distillery in his honor, just because of how much he had done for the company. And kind of backtracking a little bit, it's interesting that E.H. Taylor, being the father of bourbon and all this, with the champion of the Bottled and Bond Act. This happens in 1897. This is after Stagg dies. This is after he's left Old Fire Copper and is with the Old Taylor Distillery. Ironically, Buffalo Trace hangs on to E.H. Taylor's name with the bonded stuff with Warehouse C and the E.H. Taylor expression. They have the right to that. But that's just an interesting little thing to note. But yeah, 1904, they rebrand from Old Fire Copper to George T. Stagg.
Okay.
By Prohibition, they were one of 6 distilleries that was still able to produce whiskey in the country.
Wow.
As a medicinal whiskey.
Okay.
So they call that you could prescribe whiskey, or a doctor could prescribe whiskey, and that they were one of those distilleries.
Okay.
In 1929, Shenley Distillers purchased the George T. Stagg Distillery. They end up renaming it Ancient Age Distilling Company, which obviously people will know the name Ancient Age Bourbon. Now it's more of a bottom shelf option. But
still a product of?
Yeah, it's still a product. Still in their lineup.
Okay.
Yep. There's Ancient Age and then the Ancient Age 10 Star.
Yeah.
Both of those are still available, both still produced by the distillery. Yeah, they rename in 1969 Ancient Age.
Okay.
So they had about 40 years there where it was still the George T. Stagg Distillery before they decided to do their own thing with it. And then in 1992, Sazerac comes along, modern day tie-in here. Sazerac comes along, they buy the distillery from Shenley, because at this time the bourbon market is really on a downturn. Everyone's into vodka, gin, clear spirits and stuff like that. Bourbon and whiskey as a whole is just not doing so well. So Sazerac comes along, and if you know anything about Sazerac, you know that they've got quite the expansive portfolio.
Nowadays, they own
brands.
everything.
Yeah,
I think they own us. I don't know.
Literally, they own just about. Any recognizable brand you can think of, they've probably got a stake in it. And Buffalo Trace was no different, or I should say Ancient Age. By 1999, they ended up renaming it Buffalo Trace.
Okay.
So that's where
What's the reason for that? Do you know why?
So if you look at a bottle of Buffalo Trace, if you ever get your hands on one, the label will tell you that this was kind of to pay homage to the Buffalo Trace or Buffalo paths that were worn across the Kentucky River through that part of Kentucky. There is some actual history to that. And that's what brought the pioneers, Native Americans, west to Kentucky. You just follow the Buffalo Traces, because apparently they would cut pretty wide highways across the Midwest where they would just herds of them would roam, and that being one of them. So that was a nice little
I've always wondered.
tribute.
So.
Yeah, exactly. But now that kind of brings us to the culmination of Buffalo Trace Distillery being one of the most award-winning, dominant distilleries on the market today, and bringing us Stagg Bourbon as a way to pay a tribute to the man himself. But
so I have to ask, Elijah,
with
all that history.
Too much at once.
No, it was you never know until you know, and this is super fascinating to, that's why I love doing this, is we could dive a little bit deeper specifically with the namesake of a bourbon, who that individual was. And I have to ask, comparing Stagg to other bourbons, specifically Buffalo Trace, do you have a preference, one or the other?
In my opinion, and this is what I said the first time I tried Stagg, was that Stagg is everything Buffalo Trace should be. And I'm I'm a sucker for barrel-proof bourbons just because I think there's more flavor to unpack with those. With Buffalo Trace, you get that kind of, I don't want to call it watered down, but I will just because, I mean, it's proof down to 90 proof. I mean, this is 132 proof.
This is straight out of the barrel.
Yeah, there is significant difference there between the two of them. If you were to go and do a barrel pick of Buffalo Trace and they take you into a rick house and you draw a sample from the barrel, you'd be tasting Stagg.
Yeah.
Technically. It just doesn't have the label on it yet because it's just in the barrel. But that's what that would be.
Yeah. And then comparing this to, and I guess, do you know how the recipes, and I guess they don't release too much of the recipes, but maybe the lore behind maybe Stagg compared to like E.H. Taylor or something like that? What is, obviously one's bottled in bond.
Yes.
And, one's not. But what's the comparison between the two in your opinion? Is there a superior one?
It's tough to say. I've had Stagg, obviously we just had it right now, and E.H. Taylor barrel proof. You would think they would taste identical, being from the same mash bill, probably close to the same age, same recipe. They taste totally different.
Yeah.
And I think what that has a lot to do with is the positioning in the rick house.
Okay.
That's something they'll tell you a lot, is just where that rick house is situated on the grounds, higher elevation, lower elevation, indirect sunlight, kind of sitting in the shade. In the rick house itself.
For those listening that don't know what a rick house is, that's basically the big warehouse
that holds a bunch of barrels.
A bunch of barrels of the bourbon as it's, finishing.
Mm-hmm.
And like Elijah was saying, positioning within that rick house affects, how a barrel is aging the whiskey that's in there, or the bourbon. Whiskey until it's bourbon. So, higher in the rick house, it's hotter up there more than it is at the bottom. In the lineup, so that's what Elijah was kind of hinting to there, and I think there's a whole science behind it that you could totally dive into another episode with. But it's interesting. Like you said, you can walk all over the grounds of the Buffalo Trace Distillery and experience one thing with E.H. Taylor and another thing with Stagg and another thing with just Buffalo Trace. I'm sure it's an overwhelming experience, but really cool to see how maybe a rick house that's 10 feet higher up the hill than this rick house produces a totally different product using the same mash bill. So,
yeah, and that's a big thing. It's a good thing you brought that up. Is that rick house positioning is everything. The stuff, like you said, towards the ceiling is going to be exposed to much more drastic temperature changes as far as heat. Those don't age as long because that's going in and out of the wood in the barrel. Much more frequently than something that's sitting at the bottom. Because if you've ever been in one of these rick houses, in the summertime, even in the summertime, it's still pretty cool in there because you're kind of insulated, I would say, in there. So the stuff that's more towards the bottom can age a little longer because it's not going to evaporate as quickly. There's not as much of a drastic change in temperature. So you're getting more time with it to really, really draw those flavors out of it. Whereas the stuff that's at the top, if you wait 10 years, you'll probably have this much left in the barrel itself. It's all about evaporation and just trying to time that correctly with the bourbon to get the most out of it. I mean, to make it even worth your while to produce a product.
Yeah. Well, I guess final thoughts, Elijah, on the Stagg. This was my first time having it, but I'd like to hear yours first.
Comparatively, this being batch 22A, the last bottle that I had was batch 18. This one I like a lot better, and I had heard from some folks before we had this one on for the episode. 22A is one of the more sought-after recent batches of Stagg, just as far as how good it really is comparatively to other batches. And I agree. I think this one is significantly better than batch 18. Not to say that 18 was bad, because that one was also another one that people had spoken very highly of.
Yeah.
But this one, to me personally, was really good, and it's one that I would like to savor. But obviously, if it's good, you want to share it with your friends.
Exactly.
So we'll see how long that lasts. But it's definitely, Stagg has always been one of my favorites as far as Buffalo Trace products go. Just that low rye mash bill. Mash bill 1, I prefer more so than mash bill 2. The lower rye gives you that sweeter, more caramel corn flavor profile, and that I really enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, this is my first time, and I'll tell the listeners, definitely has some heat behind it. It's 130-something proof. It's definitely got some heat there. It's right there when it hits your tongue, and it's there after you take the sip.
It lingers.
It's not unbearable, though, and the flavors are it's really sweet. Like Elijah said, you get the corn, and I think you get a lot of that sweet corn, caramel flavors. It's very dark. You can tell there's some age behind it, and it's really good bourbon. I mean, when you think of bourbon now, for me especially, I think Stagg, because it's got the oakiness, it's got the heat, it's got the age. You're getting a feeling now after you've drinking bourbon for a good amount of time, what the age will do to your flavor profile, and I'm definitely getting it here with the Stagg. It's like the first time I've almost realized it. So it's a great product. This is great to sip on, I think, any time of the year. And
especially good wintertime whiskey.
No,
that'll warm you up.
Yeah,
it will definitely warm you up.
Being as hot as it is now, it's not terrible to sip on it, though. And this was a great choice, and we're glad that we could offer some history on Stagg here. If you like stories of George T. Stagg and other historical stories, don't forget to join the History Fix platform. You can explore the movies and these short films, things like that. All you listeners, like I said, you can use code Battlefield, BATTLEFIELD, get an extra 20% off your first year subscription, annual subscription to History Fix. So go ahead and do that to expand your knowledge and enjoy your evening. Put on some History Fix and watch some great films and short clips on there. But anything else you'd like to add, Elijah?
Well, I just want to give a big shout out to Whiskey University, Distillery Trail, and Sipping History. They aided me significantly in my research on Stagg's life, his military career, all of that stuff. Without them, I wouldn't have been able to research this topic as well as I have, to know this stuff, to bring it to you guys. So shout out to them. And as far as that goes, if you like what you heard today, follow on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, whichever listening platform you choose. Give us 5 stars if you liked it. If not, maybe don't. But that's pretty much all I've got. I just wanted to shout them out because I know that they definitely were a contributing factor to this episode.
Well, thank you, Elijah. Thanks for the Stagg, and thank you all for listening and sharing with your friends and liking. We'll hope to catch you on the next one. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.